Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the All-Ireland Food Poverty Network event. My name is Sharon Gilmore, and I am the Head of Standards and Dietary Health at the Food Standards Agency in Northern Ireland. You're all very welcome, and a big welcome as well to our online attendees, so you're very welcome as well. I am chairing the first session of today's workshop, and we have a great programme lined up this morning, and I'm looking forward to hearing from all of our speakers. Before we begin, though, some housekeeping, please. The two fire exits are at either side, and questions are welcome at the end of each presentation if time allows. If not, you can ask the question at the dedicated Q&A session at the end. If you're joining us online, you can ask questions via the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Everyone's question will be visible, and you can upvote questions. Please include the presenter's name that you would like the question to be addressed to. For any technical issues, please use the chat box at the bottom of the screen. We encourage you to tweet about the event. When doing so, please use the hashtag #FoodPoverty. Finally, please note that we will be recording this session, and recordings will be emailed to you within 2 weeks. I would now, it's a great pleasure to hand over to Anne-Marie Murphy from the Consumer Council for Northern Ireland to provide the opening remarks today. Anne-Marie Murphy is the Director of Strategy and Emerging Markets at the Consumer Council and is responsible for strategic leadership of consumer concerns in the areas of EU exit, cost of living, food affordability and accessibility, and emerging markets. Anne-Marie, you're very welcome.
Morning, everyone. Thank you, Sharon. It is nice to see you in the flesh for the first time. I've been in my position for the last 18 months to 2 years, and I suppose this is my first proper speaking engagement in person, and also nice to meet an awful lot of people here rather than behind a screen. So my thanks to safefood and the Food Standards Agency for inviting me to open this event, which focuses on the lived experience of consumers and food poverty. For those who don't know, the Consumer Council was set up in 1984. We're the representative body for consumers in Northern Ireland, and we have statutory remit in the areas of energy, transport, water, postal services, and of course food affordability and accessibility. Hence we work an awful lot in this area. And seeking out and listening to the lived experience of consumers sits at the heart of what the Consumer Council does on a day-to-day basis. We have a comprehensive research programme which listens to the concerns, the attitudes, and the lived experience of consumers across Northern Ireland in our statutory areas, not just food affordability and accessibility. And we also are very much focused on those who are most vulnerable, lower incomes, those of an older demographic, people who live in rural areas, and those with a disability or long-term health condition. So we particularly focus on those. Since 2020, we've had a dedicated food policy team in place in the Consumer Council, and my colleagues Philippa McKeown-Brown and Niamh Poocher are down the back. They are here, and I'm hoping that Pete Aiken, our other member of staff, is online and doing an online critique as we speak. They are a small team, but they are a passionate team and obviously very, very busy, whose initial focus was on the pandemic and EU exit, food affordability and accessibility, but that very quickly morphed into the cost of living crisis and the highest food inflation in 40 years. I don't need to tell the people in the room here about that. And our latest household expenditure tracker, I'm not sure if you're aware of it, but the Consumer Council for the last 18 months has been bringing out a household expenditure tracker for the lowest earning households, looking at their income, what they spend their money on, the cost of basics, and what discretionary income they have left over. And for the first time in Q1 2023, our lowest earning consumers are spending as much on food as they are on energy and housing. So it is really affecting consumers on a day-to-day basis. And our Pulse survey, which does a temperature check of consumers, and we report very quickly on that, the latest Pulse survey demonstrates that 98% of consumers are concerned about food prices. And that's just slightly more than the 97% who are concerned about energy prices. So it's right up there as a concern for consumers. And I could talk about all of the stats, but I don't think that that's really what today is about, or that's not the purpose of me being here today. I want to focus on the consumers that we've talked to, the 8,000 of them that have contributed to our qualitative and our quantitative research over the last 18 months, talking about their lived experience. And it is both sobering and heartbreaking in partnership. What we've heard can be usefully broken down into the 7 A's of food security. And I am shamelessly borrowing this from Dr. Sinead Fury from Ulster University, and I have her permission to do so. She knows that I'm using her 7 A's. And hopefully many of you will be familiar with Sinead. She listed those 7 A's at a launch of her food policy book, her book last week, Food Policy in the UK, co-authored with Professor Martin Carraher and Dr. Rebecca Wells from the Centre for Food Policy, City University London. And for each one of the 7 A's, I've used a quote from the many consumers that we've talked to who took part in our research, talking about food shopping experiences, talking about price and availability audits, talking about food focus groups and their lived experience, the impact of EU exit, and those with a food hypersensitivity. So hopefully this big green button will work. There we go. So the first A, accessibility. Where you live, where you shop, access to public transport, having a car, ownership of a car, really dictates the choices that are available to you. Again, that won't be a surprise to anybody. I am like this consumer. I live in a small village. If I was reliant on walking to the shop, the only thing I have available to me would be the prices in that shop and the stuff that they have. So I think this is a really good example to talk about accessibility. There we go. The next one, availability, number 2. Our EU exit and our food hypersensitivity research has revealed consumer experiences of missing product lines, of gaps on the shelves, of substitutions in online orders. The top quote is from a consumer that's our EU exit research, and that consumer was noticing gaps in the shelves, all over the place. The second one, more importantly, is from someone with a food hypersensitivity in our food hypersensitivity research. And if you're buying normal standard products and what you want is not there, you can get an alternative. If your health depends on a particular product and it's not there, then it has a much larger impact on the consumer who's affected. The third A is affordability. Unsurprisingly, food affordability is the biggest concern being voiced by consumers in our research. And I know exactly how this consumer feels, having looked at my food shopping the other day, and the amount of money I spent on it and what was sitting on the counter was shocking. And this, I suppose, is repeated over and over again in households across the country. In relation to the fourth A, adequate, being nutritionally adequate. So we hear a lot about how the days of cheap food are over. But our research shows us that consumers don't want cheap food. They want food at an affordable price when they have the money. Sorry, they want it at an affordable price, and they want it to be good food. And when they have the money, they'll pay a bit more to shop elsewhere, like going to the butchers or getting fresh produce over tinned. And oftentimes now what we're seeing is that consumers are sacrificing not only quality, but they're sacrificing quantity, and they're having to do without on a regular basis. The next one is appropriate. So food poverty, we know, often leads to social isolation, not having the money to invite child's school friends for a play date or to celebrate family occasions. And this consumer is exactly that. The emotional toll of not being able to have a party and invite people because you can't afford it really affects people. Awareness is the next one. So sometimes education and skills can help address the issues of food poverty. There are a lot of excellent resources on slow cooking, on meal planning, on budgets, and we've heard increasingly, just like this consumer, that they are using online tutorials and social media for recipe ideas and inspiration, because consumers know that it is cheaper to cook it from scratch, but oftentimes they don't necessarily have the knowledge or the skills to be able to do that. And the last one is without anxiety. So accessible, available, affordable food that is nutritionally adequate, appropriate, awareness to be able to prepare it, all without anxiety. Because as well as the monetary burden, food poverty takes its toll on people's emotional well-being. And sadly, we could fill a great many more slides with quotes from consumers who are struggling with their mental health, and as a result of the rising cost of living and the cost of basics on a day-to-day basis. Now, there's a lot on this slide. How do food prices make you feel? We asked our food focus groups last year regarding anxiety. We wanted to have a real understanding of what consumers were feeling about their food shopping and food prices. It was done as an emotions poll with a mix of both positive and negative emotions. And the top 4 answers, as you can see there, that are circled as I click the button. Anxious, angry, frustrated, and stressed. I think it's as important to look at the lowest scores. So consumers, they're not comfortable, they're not confident, they're not positive, and they are not satisfied. And surely, as people who work in this area, that's what you want to get out of food on a day-to-day basis. It's such a comfort. People are not finding that comfort. We know our most vulnerable consumers are taking every possible action to cut back and make changes, but many are at a loss of what to do next. And we've heard from consumers who are finding themselves in financial difficulty for the first time, unsure where to turn for support, and I've no doubt that we'll be hearing from some of the other speakers today about that. Food insecurity blights the physical and mental health of those struggling to feed themselves and their families. According to research published last week by the Children's Society, children and young people have become significantly more concerned about rising prices and their family having enough money for food compared to both the environment and crime. So it is really getting into the family dynamics. What we need is a collaborative and purposeful approach to tackling food inequalities experienced by too many. The lived experience of consumers affected by food poverty must be at the evidence base used to inform policy solutions and practical initiatives co-designed with the very people they seek to support. I'm delighted to attend this event today and sort of open it. I am very much looking forward to all of the other speakers and the experiences that they have, and to hear about the initiatives that are working to help consumers, real life initiatives. And thank you very much for having me.
Thank you, Anne-Marie. That was really insightful in bringing the consumer and the experiences consumers have into the room, so thank you. Our next session is called Cost of Living Crisis and Food Insecurity Across Disadvantaged Communities. And I very much welcome our first speaker, Stephen Moffat. Stephen is National Policy Manager at Bernardo's. Prior to working at Bernardo's, he worked across social policy areas around issues such as homelessness, substance abuse misuse, and criminal justice reform. This morning, Stephen will outline the views of parents on the impact of the cost of living crisis has had on their ability to provide their families with sufficient nutritious food. So thank you.
So thanks very much, safefood, for inviting me here today to give a presentation on findings research that we've carried out pretty much over the last 2 years. I should say at output, it's really very much about food insecurity and parents and families' experience of food insecurity. We wouldn't necessarily use the word food poverty when we chat to families, when we sit down and carry out interviews, and the reason being that as soon as we use the word poverty, families close off a little bit. So it's just a bit of context. For those of you who don't know Bernardo's, we run about 50 locations across Ireland, rural and urban, so Limerick, Cork, Dublin, Waterford, Wexford, Mullingar, Athlone, Midlands. So we're well based across the country. We run family support services. We run for families who may be struggling with various issues from parental mental health, parental separation, substance misuse, domestic violence. We run specific programs for families in which there's adopted children. We run programs around bereavement, so a whole host of programs. But food does play a substantial role in a lot of our services. We do have breakfast clubs in a couple of locations. We run 7 early years services across the country. And within those early years services, there's food provided, several meals provided a day to the children there. We provide vouchers to families. It's not something that we do in terms of a consistent necessary basis. We do have vouchers provided by corporate partners and other generous partners. And we will give them out sort of as slightly at an ad hoc basis. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in time. But also our family support services. So families who may be struggling with different issues, where we would work with them relatively intensely on a week-to-week basis. We will call out to their homes. Project workers might notice that they might be struggling financially, that there might not be much food in the house. And it's part of the way of us building up trusting relationships that, and that we're there to practically help. We will bring along sort of, different food packages depending on what the exact need is. So in terms of the research that I'm going to present on today, it's an amalgamation of 2 pieces. One is sort of quantitative research, that we've ran over the past 2 years of parents and families. So parents with children under the age of 18 and their experience of being able to provide sufficient food for their families, so their children and themselves. And on top of that is also research that I carried out earlier on this year, which was 40 one-to-one interviews with families, or directly with parents, on the issue of cost of living and the increased anxiety and stresses that it's putting on parents. Now, to be honest, about 50% of the time spent talking to parents is spent on food and shopping. I also, as part of this research, would have talked to staff across the country and their experience of what they're seeing on the ground. There are occasions in which parents will be very open, would have been very open with myself, but staff who've been working with parents for long periods of time, on the ground are able to, give a bit more context to exactly what's happening to parents at times. So the first slide here in terms of our research really just demonstrates the struggles that some parents have been having to provide children with sufficient food over the last sort of year or two. Now, these statistics are from January 2022 and October last year. We're carrying out the same research again in the next month or so. So you can see that parents having skipped meals at some point over the last 12 months, that was nearly a third last October. Felt they didn't have enough to feed their children, nearly 1 in 5. Borrowed money to feed their children, 16%, and used a food bank, so 10%. And that's up from 4% the previous year, which was, January 2022 was when cost of living was just beginning. So that was a sizable jump, and actually the Taoiseach, he queried that statistic when it came out. And all we can say is really, that's what families were reporting in the survey. And when we talked to families directly, they were saying, they were having to rely on some sort of food bank. Now, what that looks like might be very different. It might be getting a voucher from ourselves, which they would see as, essentially using a food bank, or getting support from other organisations like Vincent de Paul. So the statistics there are quite stark, and something that we do want to track over time. And they certainly did get worse over that sort of year period. chatting to the parents, you know, they really did say they were struggling to provide their children with food. And there was countless examples that I could use. You know, just having to cut back on the amount of food that they're buying, they just can't afford it. Relying on soup runs, some weeks no money for groceries, no lunch for children. Now, they were the extreme examples, you know, and examples like that where actually parents, and we have to be careful when I'm interviewing parents, where there was talk of, you know, feeling like that, there was resort to shoplifting. Now, they weren't admitting they were shoplifting, and it was only a small proportion, but that's the state that they got to. Felt like they, you know, their food budget wasn't stretching as far as it could, or would have in the past. Chatting to project workers, you can see, you know, real stark findings, such as not being able to provide children with nappies or baby wipes, bringing them into our early years services without them knowing that we would be able to provide them for them. So it was a real struggle, and has been a real struggle. I should probably point out that there are parents who have been struggling around this issue for a very long time, and it's part and parcel of what they've always done. I think what's happened with the cost of living is that it's just made it that little bit worse. But it was interesting, you know, some parents who would have, you know, struggling with low incomes, affording food for several years, you know, there's a real sort of resilience built up, but that resilience was taken a knock because things have gotten so extreme. But there's a large proportion of families, you know, we're finding, like, one thing that they were always able to provide their children and family was enough food. And because of cost of living, that's taken a hit. And that's a real struggle for the first time to have to deal with that. One of the big things for us coming out from both this, from the research, both from the quantitatives and from the interviews, was just parents having to go without. You know, really brilliant chatting to parents. You know, they really feel like it's part and parcel to sacrifice for their children. You know, they know that they have to do that. They know that's part of being a parent, but they're just having to do it on such a constant basis. You know, you see some of the quotes there where parents saying they are having to live off trash just so kids have fruit and veg, come up to a Tuesday and Wednesday before they might get social welfare payments or get you know, paid for work. They'll just have a sandwich. And that was time and time again. I was chatting to parents, you know, just, you know, when things were getting tough, they were going without. You know, there were extreme examples where parents were, you know, 3 days on sort of tinned foods. I'm not saying that was the average, but it was a real concern seeing those sort of examples. And I should really stress that, again, and this will come up a bit more, going without food over a substantial length of time is a real grind for parents. And we saw that when I was chatting to parents, but also we see it in our services. If you spend 12 months, 18 months, where every week you're going without something as essential as food, it does take its toll. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. So this is about constant worries and food. So we asked parents how often you worry about providing children with sufficient food. And again, this was just asking about their children. We didn't ask about themselves. And we saw 6% initially were always worried. And that jumped to 13%, you know, more than doubled. So, you know, about 1 in 7, 1 in 8. But if you go down the bottom, never worried, that went from nearly a half to less than a third. So we know that overall population are worried, generally worried, but there's a population that's constantly worried. And chatting to the parents, that jumped out a lot. It's parents who, you know, aren't sleeping because they're worried about whether or not they're going to have enough food for the following day. And one of the things that really, you know, a lot of this was in relation to cost of living generally and paying for other bills. But what parents were telling me was that food is different to other bills. You can't forget about food. You can't, you know, you get an energy bill, you know, once a month or once a week, and that's a whole other issue about, you know, paid meters for a lot of these families. But with food, it was something you could never turn off. You could never forget about it because your children are constantly eating. So children are obviously growing, so they probably eat more than adults eat. But also, you have one meal, 2 hours later, you're thinking about the next meal. And that was a real thing that came out for quite a few parents I spoke to. You know, if you already have anxiety as well, which a lot of these parents have, that really takes a toll. And I should say that a lot of the parents that we work, nearly all the parents we work, are facing additional adversities, as I mentioned earlier. It might be around parental mental health, it might be parental separation. You know, their housing might be very inappropriate. You know, there might be domestic violence. So the constant worry on top of those issues is a real concern for ourselves because of the impact that can have on children. It's taken their focus away from parenting. And that's not to, you know, cast any aspersions on their parenting skills. Of those who are worried about food, you know, we ask them about issues about, are they afraid to ask for help? Do they feel embarrassed? Do they feel guilty? Are they stressed? You know, one of the things we try and put out there as much as possible, not just in relation to food, but in relation to any sort of support, is that it's a real strength for a parent to look for support and ask for help. You know, we all need support at certain times. And if you're facing additional adversities, asking for help is really, really important. But we can still see some parents, you know, they might be frightened to do that. And there is still a huge amount of stigma and shame. It probably doesn't help when we raise statistics around food banks and politicians query that because they don't think people should be in that position. So reduce spending elsewhere. You know, when we look at food in comparison to other essential items, we can see that parents who are cutting back on clothes, hobbies, other household bills, children's activities. And again, you can see that these are actually getting worse over the past year. Now, it'll be interesting to see this coming year if that trend continues, because we know it's only over a short period and it covers cost of living period, or cost of living crisis. But the thing that we should say is that, you know, arguably that will have gotten worse, because we know food went up considerably more from October 2022. And it's something that parents would have just been telling us, you know, their food just isn't stretching almost as far as it would have in the past, or their food budget isn't stretching almost as far. And some of this is, you know, chatting to parents, again, directly their experience, is a bit of that choice between food, electricity, heating. Now, by and large, heating is the one that got, on average, would have gotten hit from the parents we would have spoken to, you know, which brings about its own concerns. But there is real worry about what actual food people are, the amount they're having to cut, and what that looks like. And this is just a bit about this, like, they will cut backs on food, but won't let children go without. Again, this comes back to parents going without. So they'll do absolutely everything they possibly can. But in terms of children actually going hungry, it wasn't something parents owned up to a huge amount. But they will cut back, you know, and so stopping Wi-Fi and TV in the house, quite a few parents said that. Some people, you know, when we report on that, they say, well, you know, that is a priority, you shouldn't have TV or Wi-Fi if you can't afford to feed your kids. And our whole point is, well, they're also essentials, you know. So I talked to parents quite a lot about how they're changing their shopping habits. And this came up a huge amount. So as I said, and as we know, grocery prices went up a huge amount. So their money wasn't going almost as far. And what do they have to do to try and respond to that? So they're shopping around a lot more. Those of them who can shop around a lot more, you know, as was mentioned earlier, not everyone has access to multiple places. But people go into different shops, knowing that there might be a deal on here, there might be vouchers they can use here. So they're having to go to a lot of different places. They're shopping more frequently. In the past, they might have done one big shop. Can't do that anymore to the same extent, parents, because their money just doesn't stretch as far. So they can't, what they need to survive, say, a week, they're not willing to spend on a Sunday or on a Monday to go for a week, because they're not sure if they can cover other bills in that period. They won't bring their children to shopping anymore. A lot of parents told me that. They're just too worried. Children bring about additional anxiety. They find shopping very, it causes them anxiety now, much more so than it would have. And if children throw things into the basket, it's a real trigger for them. affects their mental health. Parents talk about using calculators as they go around, or this was something in relation to other shopping as well, but going up to the till and saying there's €100, stop at that. They're planning out meals a lot more in advance, so they're not just going, right, this is the staples, this is what I get this fruit and veg, I get this meat, and over the course of the week we will decide what sort of meals we have. So they're not able to react towards what they feel like or what their children might want on the day. They're having to plan it out much more in advance. There's some families are already doing that to a huge degree, but what they're doing here is they're actually getting staples. And they're just sort of going, right, over 4 days, how can I make those staples and have a couple of fresh fruit and veg? How can I sort of bulk them out? And finally around that point was the cupboards and freezers, which they might have had stocked in the past, aren't. So some families would have, big families who would have had lots of children would have told me they'd have freezers stocked with, things they just dip their hand in, at certain points of the week, not frequently, but just if their children were suddenly extra hungry or something like that. They're not doing that, they're struggling to do that or have their cupboards stocked. So my final slide is probably the biggest finding, and I'll talk a little bit about solutions and conclusions, but was around chatting to parents was food and standard of living and the role that food plays in that. There's no talk of joy, there's no talk of, positive role that food can play. And that's not to say it doesn't still happen in those families, that they might still spend some time cooking with their children and enjoying it. But certainly when I was talking to them, it was just, this is a constant chore, having to worry about this, having to worry about shopping, providing enough for children. That does take its toll over time. And one of the things, and again, I do have to stress that I was talking about cost of living as a whole, but when the parents are thinking back on food, they were really reflecting on how hard their lives were. And some parents, it was actually, again, interestingly, parents who'd always dealt with this, who'd always really struggled, they were really coming back, look, you just have to get on with it, and yeah, it's crap. Which is, in and of itself, is worrying. They're just that constant grind for years and years. But a lot of parents who, mightn't have been at that level, who are now finding themselves in that position. And that's really affecting their confidence, their egos. It's affecting their, it's nearly building up a sense of shame about, they don't feel like they're giving their children what they want or what they need. And that's just really not the case. They're doing absolutely everything they can. It's just an issue generally around income. Finally there, it's, parents talk to me about, cost of living has cut back all their luxuries. They have no luxuries left. And those luxuries are small luxuries, in comparison to the general population. Or maybe, sorry, that's unfair to say general population. But they might have gotten takeaways in the past, and you're talking 20, 30 euro once every couple of weeks that they would sit down. Even, what parents have themselves, that's all gone. But doing it as a family, that doesn't exist anymore. They just can't afford it. And then they're constantly saying no to their children around food as well. And that really makes them reflect on just how difficult things are. And some of those, some of those quotes, parents telling me, special occasions that have gone on, mothers telling me about, one mother told me about her sister's 40th. She made up an excuse, pretended she was sick. She couldn't go because she couldn't afford it. She didn't want to ask the rest of her family because she had the €40 that it would cost for that meal. Or parents, just the constant micromanaging of their food bills is taking a toll. And unfortunately for children living in those households, they pick up on that, and something that our project workers would tell us, they know that their parents are struggling generally around cost of living, but they can really see it when it comes to food. They know that their food, what their parents are buying, what they're having for meals has changed over time. And children, again, they can get over that, but the impact on how parents feel about having to do that. I should say, I didn't bring up anything there around solutions. It's something possibly because it was so aligned with other cost of living issues. But what parents would have said around, say, particularly around food, A lot of it's just like they want the prices to come down so they can have more, or they can go back to being able to provide their children with more. But there was a lot around income, and at least having a guarantee, parents saying that they can go to bed knowing that, right, if they can't afford food for their children, that there is a safety net there, that there is somewhere that they can go and they go, right, children aren't going to go without. And some of that they know is, where it's, I think we'll talk a little bit more about the role of food banks or role of the voluntary sector. But parents also, saying they don't want to have to turn to those places consistently. So they know it is around income and getting additional support from government, around being able to provide if there's emergency situations, that there's somewhere to go. And, for us at Bernardo's, we know there's an emergency payment scheme within the Department of Social Protection. People can apply for, you could be waiting 8 weeks. And if your cupboards are empty, what good is that? But then just generally in terms of income supports, inflation has gone up so high around food. We need to see a match in social welfare payments going up with that. So yeah, that's pretty much everything. If there's any questions, happy to take anything.
We've time for one question, if anyone would like to ask Stephen a question. Yes?
I'm just curious about the role of schools. I know you support breakfast clubs, but it's not national, sure it isn't.
No.
And then the whole thing around school meals, like it's awful to think that people are humiliated in some ways by having to go to a food bank. And it just strikes me that if there was a national, I don't know whether safefood has a role in this, but in terms of pushing for school meals, so at least the children are getting fed maybe a hot meal and their breakfast. And I know the breakfast clubs have risen over the years, locally they would have, but I don't know nationally the figure, whether that's true. So
in terms of the school meals, I mean, the Department of Social Protection has made huge improvements around it. We're seeing big commitments that are coming out around, certainly around primary schools and primary DESH schools. So rolling it out further and further, which is really great. Parents who I spoke to said school meal programs is really, really positive. I think it's also iterative, making sure that they can react to what children want and what's nutritious and that sort of thing. And there have been issues around, the providers of hot school meals or school meals programs and issues around how much money they're getting essentially. But parents, did raise it, thought it was really, really excellent. But some parents didn't live in areas where it was available, or their children didn't go to DESH schools. They were on low incomes and were, technically living in deprivation and were experiencing poverty. So there's still probably a long way to go, but there has been positive developments around that. It just needs to, continue moving forward. And for some places, that's about infrastructure as well, making sure that there's, capacity for schools to provide those meals.
Okay. Thank you, Stephen. Thank you very much. And sort of brief reflections from myself. You've certainly brought forward the ongoing impact of the cost of living crisis for disadvantaged families and coping mechanisms that parents are taking to afford food for their children. And a quote that you had on your slides really brought home to me, over time it becomes a real grind. So thank you for bringing your report to the network today. The next session before the break is Hunger in Northern Ireland. So next up is Johnny Curry. Johnny is Northern Ireland lead for the Trussell Trust, an anti-poverty charity that supports a nationwide network of food banks to provide emergency food and support the people locked in poverty, and campaigns for change to end the need for food banks. Johnny will share findings from the Hunger in Northern Ireland report, including the lived experience, recommendations and learnings. So thank you, Johnny.
Thanks, Sharon, and good morning, everyone. Thanks for the opportunity to come and share our work with you this morning. My name is Johnny Curry. I work for the Trussell Trust. The Trussell Trust is a charity that originated in 1997. It started in Salisbury by Paddy and Carol Henderson, who started the charity with a legacy from Carol's mum, Betty Trussell, and they started their first food bank in Salisbury at the bottom of their garden to support a family who needed 3 or 4 days of emergency support over a period of 3 or 4 days. So then the network has grown since 1997. We now have 22 food banks across Northern Ireland. That's about 5% of the total number of Trussell Trust food banks across the UK. So we're only 5%. We're the smallest region in terms of food banks, but we're the region that's seen the highest increase in the number of food parcels given out over the last 5 years. The first Trussell Trust food bank was opened in Newtownards in 2010, and we're roughly 2/3 of emergency food provision in the north. We're not the only providers of emergency food. It shows up in all sorts of ways: social supermarkets, St Vincent de Paul, youth clubs, community centres. So we support 22 food banks in those locations. Most of them sit under the governance of some sort of church or faith-based organisation, and they manage a further 23 distribution centres close by. So food banks in our network would operate in around 50 locations across Northern Ireland. While we run food banks, we want to see an end to the need for food banks. We don't believe that food banks should have to exist. Everyone should be able to afford the essentials for themselves. Hunger in Northern Ireland is a research report that we launched at the end of June, and it's the first of its kind in terms of an in-depth study on hunger, its causes, the impacts, and who's affected in our society to date. And it evidences the main driver of hunger as a lack of money. It reveals that the social security system is failing to protect people from cutting back on food or skipping meals entirely. So Hunger in NI is the first in a series of 3 studies that we're going to be producing specifically for Northern Ireland, which examines the scale and the drivers of hunger across Northern Ireland, as well as other regional reports for England, Scotland and Wales. And the reports explore the prevalence of hunger and the need for food banks, including food banks in our network and wider charitable food support. Who's most likely to face hunger? What are the drivers that push people towards hunger that need support from food banks? And what are the factors that enable people to escape hunger and poverty? And what is the roadmap that we can produce so people no longer need charitable food support? How we gathered this information was survey samples from our network. So for the very first time, we were able to report on hunger in Northern Ireland specifically. We also surveyed the general population, and we also conducted more in-depth qualitative research than we've ever done before. And it was conducted by Ipsos, the research agency. So yeah, it is the first in a series of landmark studies. It's carried out by ourselves in partnership with Ipsos. And what are the findings? Well, 1 in 6 people face hunger across Northern Ireland. 16% of people across NI faced hunger in the 12 months to mid-2022. That translates to roughly 354,000 people. That's around the population in Belfast and the surrounding district, who've had to make very deliberate choices about how often they eat, sizes of meals, skipping meals entirely. 7% of people across Northern Ireland said that they'd received charitable food support in the last 12 months, which equates to 158,000 people. But that's just the tip of the iceberg, which is what the image is meant to describe there, as most people facing hunger haven't reached out for charitable food support. We know from our research that certain groups are more likely to face hunger than others. There's no typical person who's forced to use a food bank. However, some groups are significantly overrepresented. So 1/4 of people referred to food banks in our network are currently or have been homeless in the last 12 months, compared to just 1% of the Northern Ireland population. 61% of people referred to food banks in our network are disabled, compared to less than 1/3 of the general population. Nearly half of working age people referred to food banks in our network are living alone, compared to 1/8 of the Northern Ireland population. And over 1/4 of unpaid carers face hunger, which is twice the rate of people who don't have caring responsibilities. 48% of people referred to food banks in the Trussell Trust network live in households with dependent children. And also, 1 in 10 people referred to food banks in our network are from an ethnic minority group, compared to 2% across Northern Ireland. And a slight change in Northern Ireland compared to the rest of the regions of the UK is that women are slightly overrepresented at food banks in Northern Ireland compared to England, Scotland and Wales as well. So that's just an insight into certain groups that came up in our research. But we know that hunger in Northern Ireland isn't about a lack of food, it's about a lack of income. And the most significant driver of low income is the design and the delivery of social security. A lack of accessible information, challenges claiming benefits, income levels being insufficient, and then deductions which further reduce people's income. So firstly, people are struggling to access information about and apply for social security. It feels like they want you to disappear and go away. So people who lack information can end up missing out on entitlements that they should be getting. Around 40% of people referred to food banks in our network haven't accessed any previous advice, support, or any sort of income max support to look at other ways that they can increase their income. People face difficulties accessing benefits quickly or consistently. It took 16 weeks to get universal credit. That's why I had the food bank, to try and keep me living. Especially disability benefits are proving particularly challenging. Income levels from social security are also insufficient. 50% of people referred to food bank in the Trussell Trust network are in receipt of universal credit, with income too low to cover the essentials. The current weekly level of universal credit is £85 a week for a single adult. We've costed the price of a basket of essentials with the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, and we've estimated that it's actually £120 is a more reasonable reflection of a basket of weekly essentials and utilities. So there's a huge gap really between what that level of universal credit is and what it costs at the minimum to live some sort of dignified life. So we've estimated £120 is needed to effectively cover the essentials for a single person. This is a quote from Foyle Food Bank up in Derry. When I found myself in a position of having to claim universal credit, I was vulnerable, defeated, and voiceless. I never imagined that receipt of this benefit would compound these feelings. I was forced into this isolating system as it fell so short of what we needed to actually live. I felt inadequate and even more defeated. It failed my human needs and rights and had an adverse effect on my mental health. About 40% of people referred to our food banks have struggled with their mental health. Most then face unaffordable monthly reductions, so almost 2 in 5 people referred to food banks in our network are repaying debts to local or to national government. 41% of working age people in receipt of social security and affected by one or more caps or reductions experience food insecurity in the previous 12 months. And we know that work isn't always the answer as well. Working households are facing hunger across the UK. 1 in 5 people forced to turn to food banks in the Trussell Trust network across the UK are in a working household, but in Northern Ireland it's closer to 1 in 4. And in terms of insecure work, 1 in 3 people who've had to use a food bank in our network are in insecure work, such as 0 hours contracts or agency work as well. So work is not always the answer, and more people in our network have someone in the household who's at work, but they still aren't able to pay for the essentials themselves. Most people would like to work, but face difficulty accessing jobs, especially disabled people, carers, and parents who can't afford affordable childcare. 27% of people providing unpaid care are experiencing food insecurity, compared to 1 in 10 who don't provide care. Most people referred to food banks in Northern Ireland are more than twice as likely to have experienced adverse life events, such as bereavement, becoming sick or disabled, or domestic abuse than the general population in Northern Ireland. So 58% of people referred to our food banks have experienced those life events in the previous 12 months. And over the last 12 months, the most common one was a relationship with parents or family breaking down, or any form of bereavement, followed by becoming long-term sick or disabled. So 15% of people referred to food banks in our network have experienced 3 or more of those really huge blows in the last year. So this quote just exemplifies what can really be a perfect storm. When I'd been to the food bank after my miscarriage, my mum had been diagnosed with cancer. She had a hysterectomy. My stepdad had died. That sort of, those intersecting moments just can really push people over the edge. And food banks are last resort when people have exhausted all other avenues, and it really creates a perfect storm. So the overwhelming majority of people who use a food bank are forced to seek help as a last resort, having exhausted all other avenues. They're likely to have accumulated multiple forms of debt, run down whatever limited savings they have. They may have exhausted all options from family and friends, and it can feel like a spiral, which this illustration is supposed to point out, that's really hard to escape from. So only 1 in 7 of people referred to our food banks have savings. They're 4 times as likely to have borrowed money from family and friends. 3 in 5 experience 1 and more adverse life experiences. 1 in 5 are experiencing severe social isolation, such as domestic and are in contact with relatives, friends or neighbours less than once a month or less. 1 in 6 have no access to the internet at all, and less than half are connected in their homes. And then 2 out of 5 say they haven't received any other advice before accessing emergency food support. More and more people are accessing food banks for the first time. A common thing that our food banks hear is folks saying, I never expected to have to come here. And that's more and more of a factor. It's an unwelcome record. And this is our busiest ever period for food banks in Northern Ireland. This graph just shows you how food bank use has been increasing. We had a sharp increase during the pandemic year, which went down slightly afterwards. So we're treating the pandemic year as a bit of an outlier, but we see that the general trajectory is only upward. So last year was our busiest ever year. And across all the regions of the UK, we are the region that's given out, or that has seen the largest increase in the number of food parcels. So we gave out over 81,000 emergency food parcels to people in NI last year. This represents a 29% increase from last year and a 141% increase from pre-pandemic levels. And it's not right. It isn't right that people in our community need a charity's help to put food on the table. Everyone in Northern Ireland should be able to afford the essentials, but the cost of living and how that's rising is pushing more and more families through the doors of our food banks and other providers of emergency food. Hunger isn't and shouldn't be inevitable. We believe that there is hope. These are just some of our policy recommendations. So our UK-wide policy briefing has 4 key areas with asks around social security and crisis support, ill health and disability, work and housing. And in Northern Ireland particularly, we really need the urgent restoration of the Northern Ireland Executive to provide policies that will protect people from destitution. We need the full implementation of recent reviews of welfare mitigation and discretionary support, and the delivery of an anti-poverty strategy. All that work has been done, but we need an executive to implement it. And then upon restoration, the Northern Ireland Executive should set up a financial inclusion service to provide advice and support to people in the private rented sector who've been impacted by the freezing of the Local Housing Allowance. And our UK-wide recommendations. Well, the main one is to introduce an essentials guarantee. So that's a campaign that we're embarking on in partnership with the Joseph Rowntree Foundation to increase the level of universal credit to £125 a week for a single person and £200 a week for a couple, so that people can afford the essentials for themselves and are less likely to have to darken the door of a food bank. And also take a person-centred approach to the delivery of social security system, including involving disabled people in the system design, from application to assessments and then to decision making. We expect a really busy winter. At the start of the financial year, holiday hunger payments were cut in Northern Ireland due to budget restrictions, and food banks told us straight away that that's going to make us very busy over the summer, and it was. So July and August, which is usually a quieter time for our food banks, they were roughly, some food banks were 25% busier compared to the previous summer. Some were 60% busier. So food banks aren't getting a break. Stock levels, we rely really, really hugely on donations from the general public, have remained consistent despite the cost of living crisis. Folks are incredibly generous, but need is rising, and that's why we're seeing gaps in stock. So thank you, and there might be time for questions, but you might want your coffee.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Johnny. Time for a question, if anyone in the audience would like to ask the question. Yes.
Harriet, sorry, I'm just wondering, and it goes back to your first slide, what determines where you open a food bank? Because I saw you had a load in Belfast and up in Newtownards. Is it like a population density thing? Do you do a needs assessment, or how do you?
That's a good question. All our food banks are independent of us, so they're all independent charities. Food banks really open up where people see that there's a need. So whenever someone contacts the Trussell Trust and says, we'd like to open a food bank, we then start a conversation around what is the other provision like in your area. So we don't want to duplicate existing support that's already there. So it really is a community-led response in terms of what they think is the need. So we encourage them to look at who are the other stakeholders. Is there a need? Are you duplicating something else? If you are, they need to work in partnership with them. So it's really a very localized approach that we take. We aren't looking for brand new food banks, or we aren't seeking to open brand new food banks, but if there's a gap, happy to work with people.
Okay, thank you. One more question? Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I wanted to know, back in 2002, there was a study that took place in Canada, where they said that if the welfare policies of the government is conditional, which was the case in Canada back in 2002, the queues outside food banks increased. Now, do you find the similar case in the UK as well? Is it that the government policies are becoming increasingly conditional? The social protection is becoming conditional and people can't access it. So what they do finally is to stand outside food banks and, get their food needs catered to.
Yeah, we have found that since 2010, whenever austerity policies from Westminster, from the Conservative and the Lib Dem coalition, although it didn't start then, the stigmatising of people on social security started in the 90s under New Labour. But certainly since then, when severe cuts were starting to be made to social security, that's when our food banks really started to open. So the rise in food banks has dovetailed with a much more stringent and stigmatising approach to social security, certainly.
So you are finding the same thing what happened in the
Yes.
study I was mentioning?
Yep, it has followed that pattern, yes.
Okay, and one more question. It's very ironical that you want to increase your reach as a trust, but food banks should not exist, as you just said. So how do you strike a balance between?
Yeah, it's a good question.
Yeah.
I know we're going to go for coffee, so
Yes.
I'll be brief. It does sound quite contradictory, and how we address that is through three main themes: changing communities, changing minds and changing policy. So changing communities means that local communities are best placed to actually know what's needed to end the need for food banks. It's a strong network of referral agencies, well-funded community services. Everything that's good that makes a food bank exist should exist in some other form. So, that strong resilience, volunteer spirit, partnership working, collaboration, that can take the form of something else. Changing minds is around how can we build greater empathy around what are the drivers of food bank use, what it means to use a food bank, why certain groups use a food bank more than others. And our food banks are a resource around that, helping to build empathy. And in terms of changing policy, having food banks where we have them and the data that we're able to collect enables us to produce reports like this so we can say, look, here are the drivers, here's what needs to happen. So that's a tension that we sit within in terms of we have a network that even in some parts of England that's almost industrial size levels of emergency food provision. We don't want that to be mainstreamed. So we are walking a bit of a tightrope when we want this ask, but we want to make sure that we're not mainstreamed. And to be honest, we're almost on the verge of that. So we sit right in the tension of that. I just want to admit that. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Johnny. Johnny, thank you very much. We're now at the stage where we're taking a brief tea break, if that's okay. So, but just to remind you, if you're joining us online, you can ask questions via the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Everyone's question will be visible, and you can vote up questions, but please include the presenter's name. And just to say, Johnny and Stephen will be available at the end for the final Q&A session. So it would be certainly, if you have any further questions in the room or online, they would be very welcome. So if we could just maybe take a break now. I know the networking and do take time to chat with each other and to build connections. And we will reconvene again at 11:25. Thank you.
I'm Aileen McGloin. I'm the Director of Nutrition at safefood, and I'm delighted to be your chair for the second half of the proceedings today. So I have the great pleasure then of welcoming Dr. Claire Pettinger. Claire joins us from Plymouth University, where she is a registered dietitian and public health nutritionist and associate professor of public health dietetics. Claire is here today because she's co-leading on a really exciting project called Foods Equal. It's a 5-year consortium project that's focused on co-production of healthy, sustainable food systems for disadvantaged communities. And this presentation is going to showcase some of the creative solutions used within Foods Equal and explore some of the challenges and benefits of using the community-centric approaches that she's using and how these creative approaches could lead to more equitable and lasting solutions for food system transformation. So Claire, you're very welcome. Thank you.
It's a real pleasure to be here today with you, and thank you for inviting me to present. I spoke at a similar event a few years ago, and what's really nice about coming again today is that I'm reflecting on how my research has evolved over the years, which is really exciting. And I'd like to just stipulate that although I'm here myself today, there's been quite a lot of support for my efforts in putting this presentation together, so it's kind of a team effort. So you can imagine other people stood here as well. So this is what I'm going to be covering. I'm going to say a little bit about the context, the problem we face. This is a system problem. We're thinking food system issues and the need for creative solutions. I'm going to say a little bit about the Food Sequel project so that you've got a little bit of vision and structure there. And then I'm going to be focusing in on some exemplars for engagement. We are using community food researcher model to really get the community voice heard in the work that we're doing. So I'm going to say a little bit about how we've set them up. And then I'm going to say a little bit about how they've been involved in some of our active research tasks. And then I'll say a little bit about how you can critique that in how we move forward, and a little bit about our future work as a project. So you don't need me to tell you that the problem is our food system is broken, and that's a contested way of looking at it, but I would argue that it is. It affects social, economic and natural environments, yet it's distorted by inequalities in access, as we've already heard this morning. We see increasing risk of food insecurity and people unable to afford to eat a healthy and a sustainable diet. We've heard this morning, we've heard the stark figures relating to that. And disadvantaged communities, as ever, are the worst off. And they're often treated as powerless recipients of dietary and health initiatives, as well as choiceless consumers within food supply chains. And as a result, lower socioeconomic communities have poorer health outcomes. So we need to do things differently. I'm a great believer that there's an urgent need for us to get creative with the way that we tackle social and nutritional inequalities. And co-creative approaches can support involvement of communities and citizens in decision making. Such approaches can challenge elite models of policy and research, such that top-down expertise and professional authority are subverted in favour of a more democratically inclusive and participatory quest for knowledge. I'm an advocate for co-production methodologies, and I'll say a little bit more about that, which are more inclusive, more democratic, fair and non-stigmatising, challenging some of the issues of power that we know are inherent in research practices. But co-production as a term is quite a messy process, and I'm right in the thick of that messiness. So if I'm trembling at the thought of even mentioning it, that's why. So at its core, co-production has values that relate to being human, so valuing people. We heard about empathy and compassion. It's inclusive, so it supports participation. It's transparent, so there's a sharing of power. And it challenges the status quo, even when that's the hardest thing to do. And it can facilitate both creative and inclusive collaborations with multiple stakeholders, which is needed within the food system, to produce more innovative, community-identified responses and solutions. So theoretically, it sounds like a great concept, but the reality is that there remains a lack of consensus on what co-production should look like, how it should be done, the processes involved. So therefore, we quite often see a misappropriation of its use in practice. Now, my experience to date has included a lot of participatory and creative methods, and I'm a real advocate for having fun while we're trying to kind of create solutions for problems. And for over a decade, I've been exploring various creative methods with food at the centre, working with marginal and socially excluded groups. And so a list of some of the things that I've worked on in my research and published: photo elicitation, participatory food events. I've used collage. I've even been known to get my ukulele and sing. That's for another presentation, perhaps. And I've also done quite a lot of work around participatory film making, and the current project I'm going to talk about in a minute. And what I've learned from using these types of approaches, a lot of reflexivity is needed. You need to consider very carefully the ethics of participation and what that means for all participants. There are power relations inherent in this work, and that's something, again, that needs to be considered. It's emotional work, it's hard work, it takes time, and that can be hard for everybody involved. And called into question from a research perspective is the rigour, the trustworthiness, and the credibility of such approaches, and that's something I'm always grappling with as a researcher. And it goes without saying, to do co-production methods properly takes time and resource, and that's quite often something that we don't have the luxury of with funded projects. So I'm going to come back There's a lot of literature to support all this, and I'll come back to some of the critique in a minute. But I wanted to move on to say a little bit about the Food Sequel project. So the Food System Equality Project is a project that's all about co-production of healthy and sustainable food systems for disadvantaged communities. This is a UKRI Strategic Priorities funded consortium project that is quite a mouthful to get out. £6 million project, and it's led by the University of Reading. It's one of 4 £6 million 5-year consortium projects that's been funded through this funding stream, and there's 11 other smaller £2 million food system projects also happening alongside. So this is a big programme of research. Our consortium for Food Sequel is made up of academics from Reading, Plymouth, Kent, Cranfield and Sussex. It's also made up of business partners coming from Premier Foods, the Association for Convenience Stores. We have 4 communities involved across England: Plymouth, Tower Hamlets, Brighton and Hove and Reading. And we have advisory reps from Sustain, Kantar, the Food Standards Agency, the Food Ethics Council, etc. So this is massive. And the vision of the project is to provide citizens of socio-culturally diverse disadvantaged communities with choice and agency over the food they consume by co-developing new food products, new food supply chains, and new policy frameworks, all related to food. And these are all intended to deliver affordable, attractive, healthy, and sustainable diets. So this is a big, ambitious project. And you can see the big, ambitious diagram there, which makes me break into a cold sweat when I look at it. But phase 1 basically has already been done. The benchmarking phase was for us to look across the UK and benchmark what the diets of disadvantaged communities look like. From that point, we moved into our local communities to see how that relates to the lived experience within the communities. And the phase we're currently in is the innovation phase, when we're working very closely with our communities to identify and co-design new food products, new supply chains, and new policy frameworks. Once we've done that, we will be evaluating this test, learn, adapt, evaluating and hopefully scaling up to a national level. So watch this space. So there's a lot going on in this project. But what I wanted to turn to now is my Plymouth involvement. So I'm the principal investigator for the Plymouth work package of Food Sequel, and I wanted to focus on that because that's what I've got most direct involvement in. Community-centred food system change for Plymouth. What's important to us is that whatever we're doing is relevant to Plymouth as a city and building the capacity and capability within the city. And so far in Plymouth, we've been training a team of community food researchers who have been central to our work. Now, these are members of the community who have been brought on board to become co-researchers. And it's the activities of these individuals that I'm going to be sharing with you now. It's their voice, really effectively, that I'm trying to get across. Now, I would have liked to have had them with me by my side today, actually sharing, but you're going to have to listen to me instead. But I have got some quotes from the community food researchers to exemplify what I'm talking about. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about 3 main things. I'm going to talk about the setup, the training, and some of the activities that the community food researchers have been undertaking. I'm then going to move on to the first research activity that they were involved in, which is a shopping basket task. I'll then move on to the third workshop stream that the community food researchers were engaged in, which relates to our innovation in Plymouth, and then hopefully things will make a little bit of sense to you. So my first point is the community food researchers. This table here, I know it's quite a cluttered table, but it illustrates the setup of our community food researchers in Plymouth. And what you can see at the top row there, we had a very intensive 4-month setup phase. And this involved things like reviewing models, liaising with contacts, community mapping, finding out what was already going on in the area, what worked, etc., and co-creating a training toolkit for our community food researchers. The next phase was recruiting and training our community food researchers, and we used various different approaches, usually creative participatory approaches for that. And then from March 2022 to to the present time, our community food researchers, CFR for short, are engaged in various food sequel research activities. So we have 5 community food researchers now that have been trained in Plymouth. A really interesting group of individuals who have got such incredible spirit. I'm humbled to even be sharing the excellent work that they've been doing. What's really interesting, the column down the side is all these considerations that go alongside, and these are the things that we're really spending time critiquing and reflecting on, because these are the things if you go to do this kind of thing, you want to know what it means in practice, how much time it's all going to take, and these are the things we're continuing to reflect on. Ongoing training, for example, support for everybody involved, the community food researchers, mentorship, accreditation, remuneration, how do you pay them and how does that work? How does that relate to benefit disruptions, etc.? There's a lot of really crucial considerations, resources. So these are all ongoing considerations. And then the next thing is, so I mentioned Plymouth, but in Reading, Tower Hamlets and Brighton and Hove, they're also doing similar work. So we are thinking about how we connect between those 4 communities, how Brighton and Hove are doing things slightly differently, how all that relates. And of course, this is a research project, so we're interested in how we mobilize the knowledge, how we can disseminate and share our findings and our knowledge in a way that really gives voice to those community food researchers. And so we're thinking about how we can get them involved in writing papers and doing that in ways that suit their kind of literacy needs, etc. But their achievements to date have been incredible. And excuse me, the next slide shows that these are some of the kind of engagement activities that we've been doing. We've done a lot of research skills training, and that includes ethics and confidentiality and GDPR and those sorts of things. We've done some fun things. You need to have fun in the process. Foraging walks. We've had cream tea events. We've created a cooking community cookbook. We've done quite a lot of research tasks that I'll touch on in a minute. There's a monthly breakfast meeting that's hosted in the community. They've even come in and done a session with my nutrition students, which was quite incredible. And other activities like research newsletters, writing blogs, putting things on the website, that sort of thing. So they've been involved in a lot of things, and these are ongoing. And here are some quotes. So this is the voices of the community food researchers coming through. It's a great opportunity to learn and for us to develop as well. These are all quotes that have come from the community food researchers. The skills we've gained, like listening and learning how to ask a question to get more information, that can even be useful in everyday life. I get out of bed because I know it's interesting to come along. Before, it was like, I don't want to get out of bed. But I'm getting to the meetings now at 9 o'clock in the morning. So you can see how there's a real kind of gathering of knowledge in a really positive way and an engagement with that process. So the next thing I'm going to talk about is the first activity, the first research activity that our community food researchers got involved in. And this was a shopping basket activity. I don't want to say too much about what we did on a national scale before we came to this point, but what we did basically was that we took benchmarking the diets of disadvantaged communities. We analysed well-known data sets that are available UK-wide to find out how the diets of disadvantaged communities look. We're all familiar with these data sets. And the main flag here, I'm not going to go into detail of this, the main flag here is that none of these data sets actually specifically focus on disadvantaged communities as participants. So we know that they underrepresent the communities that we're interested in. And that for me as a nutrition professional is really, really crucial, because we make massive assumptions in everything that we do that these data sets are accurate, but they're underrepresentative of our communities of interest. So what we did then was we created this hypothetical shopping basket which explored the cost of the food items based on the national data sets. And the results you can see here show the spend compared between those socioeconomic groups. And you can see here what disadvantaged groups spent more on, less on, and the same on. But what we wanted to do was find out how that relates to the community's lived experience. So what we did was we co-designed a participatory method with our community food researchers in order to bring that national benchmarking down to the community level. So this shopping basket, my slide's a little bit cut off at the top, shopping basket method with the community food researchers. We started off, we did a range of series of workshops, started off with a kind of individual free recall, what do you commonly eat? We then went into kind of group work around frequency of eating. We then brought in those national data sets to see how does that relate to your lived experience. And then we talked a little bit about what you would like to change and aspirations, etc. Oh, thank you. So that's what we did. And here, a little bit from those findings, we ran 5 workshops in Plymouth, 31 participants. The mean age was 61 years. And what we found from those findings was that the top priority identified from our communities was around food access. Now, we've heard this is such a crucial point. Transport to large supermarkets were issues. Local fruit and veg shops had closed, so access to healthy, fresh fruit and veg was limited. And there was a real stigma identified around accessing food aid. So the main findings up here around habits relate to affordability. Well, okay, we know that, don't we? So it consolidates what we already know. But when we compared to the national data with that local lived experience, what we see at the bottom 4 is the aspirations for change. What people wanted was good quality, affordable fruit and veg, usable quantities of fruit and veg, a wider variety of local fish, so fish cropped up in Plymouth, which is interesting, and a desire for less packaging. So from these workshops, what we were able to do was to establish food items of importance to our local Plymouth community, which could then be taken forward into the next stage of our Food Sequel project, which is around innovation. So the 2 food items that were identified for Plymouth to innovate on are fish and veg. Just to give you a little bit more of the community researcher voice, here's another couple of quotes from the community food researchers. When we run workshops, we use the skills and the things we've learned about become real because you hear people's stories and then it becomes real. It's really interesting when we're running events or workshops to see how people have such different perspectives and outlooks. You can see that the connection, the relationships, really important in that community engagement work. So the final example of a research activity I wanted to share with you, and this is where we are currently, and this is a really exciting element to what we're doing, is the concept development workshops that were co-designed with our community food researchers. Now, fish was identified as important in our local community in Plymouth, and as a coastal city with such a strong heritage and history in fishing, it made perfect sense to focus on fish. And it's contentious, because of the sustainability angle, but we ran with it because it was truly what the community said they wanted. So what did we do here? We ran a series of fish workshops in our community of interest, co-designed by our community food researchers, and these were designed as innovation concept development workshops. And that meant that we had a desired outcome in mind at the start. We wanted to find out what, if anything, community members wanted in terms of innovation around fish. And our community members were invited, industry partners were invited, business partners were invited to participate in these workshops. And we discussed fish eating habits, why, when, how fish was eaten. And we also wanted to get a sense of innovation, aspiration around fish, and what potentially could be improved or changed around fish. It was all the workshops were participatory, so conversations were recorded and transcribed. We used drawings, diagrams, storyboarding to facilitate the identification of fish eating behaviour, and also a kind of ranking voting system so that people could decide on what their innovation might be. We also experimented with participatory data analysis. This is a really important part of co-production methods from a research perspective. And we had a lot of fun doing this actually, because we took all the transcriptions and recordings and printed them off, cut them into lots of quotes, and worked in small groups to decide on how they might all be categorised and themed, etc. And this was all of the community food researchers involved in that process. And what a process it was incredible. And what you can see on the right here, and this, they came up with this themselves, it's a shame it wasn't here, and they came up with this jellyfish made of fabric. So this was one of the creative outputs, and that jellyfish made of fabric shows the overarching themes that emerged from that data extraction. So you've got cost at the top, that is the most important thing. And then you've got, can't quite see what they are actually. You've got kind of policy, you've got value, health value, you've got the socio-cultural, the environment, and the aspiration. So that relates to all the bigger picture things that we identified. So just to give you, I'm going to rush through this quite quickly, but from the analysis of the transcriptions, we came up with a list of fish eating habits and barriers to eating fish that we already know is represented in the literature. Yeah, there's nothing new here. Things like there's a real variety of fish eating habits in the community. The tradition is important, special treats, you know, some people love fish, some people hate it. So it's got, you know, the fish eating habits were as you would imagine to be in relation to the literature. Similar, the barriers that were spoken about in relation to fish, but these became really important because cost is there, of course, but not knowing how to cook it, not knowing what type to eat, sensory properties were flagged, fussy eating, access and availability, a really, really important aspect. In our particular area, there was no fish other than the fish you got in the local co-op, which, you know, in terms of quality was flagged as not being particularly nice, and lack of opportunities. So from these various analyses and discussions, the community food researchers and the research team came up with 6 concept briefs to innovate around fish. And this next slide shows what those 6 concept briefs were. Marketing was around improving awareness of fish, getting to know different types of fish, etc. Tasting opportunities, providing people with the opportunity of tasting different types of fish, different species. A tinning plant for Plymouth. I mean, we had a lot of really interesting discussions around fish, and none of the fish that lands in Plymouth stays in Plymouth. Well, I mean, that's the same for the UK. But, you know, how can we maintain it in the local area? And that's the big question of access. Innovating supply chain, making fish more accessible and affordable to the people of Plymouth. Changing the rules around quotas. We had a big, massive kind of global discussion around fish quotas, etc. The last one, I think, is the most interesting, and we called it closing the gap. And this is about the essence of the Food Sequel project. So how can community voices be heard in policy decision making? And that is something we're trying to work out, how we can link our community voices to those influencers of policy. So following the co-creation of these fish concept briefs, we then ran a survey in the community to find out which ideas were most appealing. The community, with support from our community food researchers, decided to combine marketing, tasting opportunities and innovation of supply chain. We then ran various kind of food supply type activities with the communities, so we can consider what we're doing for our innovation. And the innovation, the next step's innovation, and in fact, hot off the press, the biggest thing that we've discussed with our industry partners, all our local fishing stakeholders in Plymouth, and there is an appetite to design a Plymouth fish finger. Yeah, so this is, you're the first people to have heard this, because not even my research partners know about this. So that's what we might be doing, and what we're trying to incorporate into that is locally line-caught sustainable fish sources. Yeah, so keep that in your mind, and maybe in a year or so time we might have some publications in relation to that. A couple of more quotes from the community food researchers. I've learned a lot about fish, different types of fish, more about the laws relating to fish and quotas. when you look at the whole thing, it's vast. So always, whatever we do, whether it's also training, a workshop, for me, it always raises more questions than answers. So whenever we have a workshop together, we come away going, oh, this is so massive. It's complex, but it really is about capacity building. And we've seen some incredible, you know, our community food researchers have got really incredibly inquiring minds. And I, as a kind of leader of the leader, I feel that we're all kind of in charge really of the project, but I'm always questioned in ways that really allow me to reflect and be reflexive about my research practices, which is really encouraging from my perspective. So taking into account all of the community food researcher reflections on all the activities that we've done, I've done a bit of preliminary interpretation in the context of the literature to critique what it is we're doing and this process of setting up community food researchers to actually engage in this co-production way of practice, research practice. So there's a few things here. You know, our community food researcher engagement has consolidated a lot of evidence that's already out there that focuses on knowledge exchange, knowledge mobilization. Knowledge is quite a wide and broad and very open to interpretation kind of concept. It's a well-known aspect of co-production linking to those related themes of capability, agency, empowerment, all those things as community practitioners we're trying to do in the work that we do. And there's a lot that has been written about that. The second thing is the building of relationships, not just the building of relationships, but the maintenance of those relationships. It's taken us quite a long time to get to where we are. We're 2.5 years into the project now. And, you know, our relationships have reached a new place. So this isn't just something that, oh, we've built the relationships, now we can move on. This is an ongoing dynamic kind of maintenance of those relationships. And that's a really interesting process, but it's a vital part of collaboration and connection. And that paradigm that needs to be shifted towards more relational and transformative, socially inclusive food system research, which is really what we're trying to do here, which places that human connection at its heart. It's all about relationships and community assets, as we know it, really putting that at the heart of the work. And that also relates to this notion of community capacity building and or resilience. You know, we hear these terms used quite a lot. And certainly, you know, post-COVID, a lot of the focus of attention of local authorities has been around building resilience, building capacity in communities. And Megan Blake in Sheffield has written a lot about that. And if you're not familiar with her work, I would check her out. From a research perspective, such approaches and such engagement techniques add value to research processes, but that is another thing that needs to be critiqued, not to be tokenistic. Oh, I'm doing a bit of co-production, I'll tick that box. You know, and many funders are like, oh, how do we get patient and public involvement, get that box ticked? It's a complete philosophy, co-production. It's not just a tokenistic tick box. And that's something that we're constantly grappling with because of the time it takes to do well. But this is about meaningful participation for a range of diverse communities. And that's thought to impact health inequalities, as you can see from the quote on the side there, and is clearly seen as a current emerging methodological push for funders. Now, I consider myself in quite a privileged position because our funder has given us free rein to do this, to really explore and experiment with this type of working. And I'm seeing this more and more coming through from some of the big funders, is that this is the way that we can really tackle some of the true kind of poverty and some of those questions that we're asking of the work that we're all doing. And last but by no means least, complexity. I mean, it's all consuming, this type of work. And I mentioned right at the start that our food system is broken, and although it can feel really overwhelming, research does need to acknowledge and embrace complexity, and we need to be thinking of the system, you know, individuals at the end of the consumer chain or whatever, you know, this is a system issue and it needs to be tackled, and the solutions need to involve all the different players in that system. So acknowledging and embracing complexity is something that, rather than the fear of, or the dread of complexity, it's embracing that as an opportunity for learning. So that social action and some of the public services that go alongside that can be more responsive of the needs of individuals. And for example, in Plymouth, our public health teams are really embracing new ways of working, human learning systems, really appreciative inquiry, really finding out what our communities and individuals within communities want and need. And our community food researchers, as part of Food Sequel, have really embraced this complexity. I mean, you know, I'm not surprised, but they really are quite excited by the messiness and the complexity and that ongoing challenge that we face to try and really get some solutions in place when we think about the next steps and the innovation. So just to kind of round up then the future work and next steps. Obviously, you know, what we're doing is quite small scale, and we have to think about how we can scale it up. And what works in Plymouth isn't necessarily going to work in Brighton and Hove and that sort of thing. So we are now considering how we can, you know, kind of exchange all the knowledge and all the learning between the different communities in the Food Sequel project. But we are on the cusp of the innovation phase, which is quite exciting, if not slightly daunting, because we've got supply chain colleagues, we've got affordability colleagues, we've got all these different academics working on their bit of the project. And the thing that really is at the fundamental, and I know some of the other speakers spoke about policy, how do we influence policy? And you know, that's one of the things across all these consortium projects that we're thinking about. How can we really do that in a meaningful way that's, again, not just tokenistic? So we're doing quite a lot of policy work moving forward. We'll be involving our community food researchers, and we want to introduce them to some of the policy influencers and creating some meaningful dialogues that can influence. I mean, fish and veg, you know, there's some really interesting kind of possible supply chain innovations and some policy innovations there. So that's the bit around the transformation, the next steps, that hopefully in a couple of years I'll have some more stuff to feed back to you. But making innovation a reality and supporting that action to roll it out, and then trying to upscale it nationally. When it comes to, I've already said about the community food researchers, you know, evolving that model and the relationships that we've built with them, you know, working with them, working out at what stage they're ready to step up to take on more responsibility, and how we can acknowledge the skills and the capabilities that they have and research skills, and at what point it becomes difficult and challenging, and at what point we can offer accreditation and further training, etc. There's the whole bit about knowledge mobilization, and as a researcher that's really important, but we're trying to do that, you know, at a level that it's not just the institution sharing their knowledge. We're really trying to involve the communities in how we do that, and there's a big critique there from anyone who's a researcher in an institution. It's all about research exercise framework and impact. I mean, I can say that impact is, we've seen the impacts of what we've done already, but trying to translate that into a ref framework or a ref case study becomes quite difficult. So there's some interesting stuff happening. We're also doing another piece of work. We've got an extra piece of funding to look at how co-production is happening across some of the other food system transformation projects. And although we are working with communities, there are other projects that are working with farmers, they're working with retail partners, and they're working with industry partners. So there's some really interesting nuance there about how we can work with different stakeholders and map how that's done. I wanted to give a little shout to my PhD student, Hannah Gardner, who is halfway through PhD, looking at the impact of the community food researcher model for food system transformation. So Hannah's doing some really arts-based visual methods around the ethnographic journey of our community food researchers. So there will be some really, really interesting creative outputs there once Hannah gets those published. No pressure, Hannah, if you're listening. But yeah, so final slide then, but I think I'm actually on time, that's right. So this is what Laura, our community food researcher, this quote: "In the long run, Food Sequel is doing a lot more than improving people's perspectives on food. It's brought people closer together, it's built friendships, helped with mental health, and is doing a hell of a lot more than just food." And this speaks positively of what we're doing in Plymouth to engage with the less affluent communities who are left behind by the traditional food system. And our preliminary findings can show some of the early impacts of engaging communities, our community food researchers, in our research processes. And considering what next for Plymouth is crucial, but community involvement is key for moving forward, so that their voice really, truly is what shines through when we're sharing our research impacts. So I guess, our research to date highlights the utility of creative co-production methods in advocating with rather than for communities, and the great potential of such progressive methods that can lead to those equitable and lasting solutions that really build capacity. Without, of course, none of this would be possible without acknowledging my incredible research team. I've got the most incredible team in Plymouth: Louise, Lisa, Hannah, Paridi, Naomi, Ian and Luke. And last but by no means least, the most important people in all of this are our community food researchers. And I'm hoping that someday you can hear them speak. They are speaking, and it would have been great to make that possible. But they will at some point, and they are beginning to kind of step up, and they've built confidence enough to be able to say, well, I can do that. So maybe the next time we can bring a couple of them over. So I think that's it from me. I think that's it, yeah. I think I probably said enough.
Folks, in the interest of sticking to time, particularly for those online, we'll hold our questions for Claire, if you don't mind. We do have a full half hour after the next speaker to ask questions to the whole panel, and I do understand that there are lots of questions from our participants online already building up, so I'm delighted to hear that. Our next speaker is Megan Vyman. Megan, you're very welcome. Megan is a community supermarket manager in Well-Fed, which is a community supermarket in Ards and North Down. Megan works on a one-to-one basis with individuals and families who are in crisis. And Megan is going to tell us a little bit about the co-creation process for the development of Well-Fed, the journey since they've launched, and the impact it's having now. So thank you very much, Megan.
Hi everyone, thanks for having me today. So I am the manager of Well-Fed, which is our social supermarket programme. I understand James Elliott was here last year from the DFC, and he had done a wee bit of work introducing the social supermarkets. So hopefully I can extend on that a wee bit more with the structure of Well-Fed. So why did it start? Northdown Community Works is the larger umbrella charity which supports all of the work carried out in the warehouse where we are currently based. The director and the manager of the warehouse noticed a gap in the community support, and we're also becoming increasingly tuned in to the amount of food waste in Ards and Northdown, our local council area. People were struggling, and there is more than enough food to go around. It's ending up in landfill, it's ending up in our bins, there's more than enough. So with this in mind, they started to combine various elements of a crisis kitchen, a community fridge, and then we did drop-ins for breakfast, lunch and dinners. These still continue today, and at the height on a Tuesday, we're feeding about 120 people just to come in for lunch. They began to see that even though there were short-term supports such as food banks, there was a need for a two-pronged approach to supply food, but also try and empower people to change their situations and strengthen their financial independence. So this was then they started looking at various social supermarket models happening across the water and closer to home. So a co-design team was set up, and this included all sorts of local community organisations, the Department for Communities, the Council, local further education college, our local food banks, and things like that. So this roundtable helped us to make decisions on criteria, potential outcomes, what the social supermarket should sell, and also the pricing structure. And to this current day, many of the code design groups still help with the wraparound that we offer the members on the programme. So here's a few wee pictures of inside our social supermarket. You can see all the sorts of produce that we have. Some of the items in the shop are donated as surplus from local growers, from their allotments, from farmers. We also then get donations from the hygiene bank, and then local businesses, and also FareShare is quite highly involved as well. Things like meat, lunchbox items and frozen food is then purchased from the larger supermarkets such as Asda or Tesco's. And also, just to give you a wee bit of background of what it looks like inside the shop, we also promote healthy eating, so we incorporate our wraparound of budgeting, cooking and meal prep with a recipe board which is changed every week. And the recipe then is based on the fresh produce available in the room at the time. And you can't really see there very well in the photo, but all the items are priced using real supermarket prices. We don't use the symbols or colours or anything like that, so that further helps them with our budget and wraparound. So how does the social supermarket itself work? Since our launch in September last year, we've already had more than 166 people apply. Although not all of them have been suitable, we're in a great position then where we are in the warehouse to signpost people to other services, such as the community fridge and the drop-ins, and then the other services inside our wider community. People can self-refer into our programme, or services such as the YMCA, Women's Aid, etc. may refer on their behalf. We then assess their form to see what criteria they meet and ask the most important question to us: can this person be helped, or at least start to be helped out of their situation within the 6 months on the programme? If the answer is yes, this may be because we can help them get back on their feet following a domestic violence situation. Their debt might be manageable enough that they can use the money saved on the programme to start paying this off. Or this person might not be receiving the correct benefits, so they require the support of Make the Call, the Universal Credit Drop-In, community advice, to try and then get back up on their feet and get those benefits applied for, and also cover the amount of time that it takes to get those started. On the other hand then, the answer might be no, they're not suitable for the programme, they can't be helped in a 6 months timescale. That might be because they're already receiving their full quota of benefits, and the benefits just aren't simply enough to live on. That is a government issue, and it's linked into the cost of living. And although then we can't help on welfare at that point, we will then ask the warehouse then to step in and provide support for that family. Another common issue is that single parents with preschool aged children want to go back to work, but they simply can't because childcare is far too expensive. So then moving on to the membership fee, if a person is suitable, they'll pay a membership fee of £5, £7 or £10, and that will be dependent on the size of their household. And for this fee, which they pay every week, they will get a 40, 60 or £80 shop in the social supermarket. Members are then advised that the wraparound is a compulsory element of the programme, and they can access the social supermarket for 6 months or until they reach their goal, which can sometimes be sooner. So this is our wee pride and joy. This is our well-fed van. We really wanted the van to remove further barriers because our council area is quite large with the Ards and North Down Peninsula. It means then that we can go a wee bit further afield outside of Newton Ards and Bangor, and people in more rural areas can then avail of the social supermarket coming to them. So we have a van driver, and he will then pack up the van and take just some of the items then down to them. And while the van is not being used for the social supermarket members, it ensures that the other food supports at the warehouse are fully stocked. So the van collects from Tesco, Lidl, KFC, Nando's via the Foodiverse app, and also from local farmers and local businesses in our area, such as Mash Direct, which have been really helpful. So the wraparound support available then. To date, we have supplied about 14 plus types of wraparound, and those are the top 5 that are requested. The wraparound provided is intensive one-to-one work, and by keeping our numbers on the programme at a time smaller, then we believe that we can provide more transformative change for the individual and their family. To date, 94% of our members agreed or strongly agreed that the stress of finances was causing harm to them or members of their household. Therefore, we try to ensure that everyone completes a budget planner, is provided with information regarding their local credit union, and is also referred to debt support if required, and that's for everyone on the programme. We can also then put in local referrals for counselling services and also stress management programmes in our area. So the impact then, a few quotes from some of our shoppers. They have said, "Shopping in Wellfed has been a real lifeline and has helped me so much with electric and gas. I'm really trying to change my life and get out of debt. I'm really enjoying being part of the programme, and my family are starting to make changes." So that gives you a real idea of the impact that the programme is having on people's lives. And we really feel that when we're reporting back to the council and the DFC regarding our progress, it's vital to include case studies, because although statistics are important, they don't always allow us to appreciate the real outcomes and the real people behind the numbers. So a 95% increase on life satisfaction is amazing, but this may be due to getting a job, paying back debt, finally having a savings account, or just knowing how to manage your money. So changes since the launch. We recognised that midway through, our criteria to join the programme was maybe a bit wide and a bit vague. So we therefore tightened our approach, and we've already noticed the amount of people not taking part in the wraparound or not attending has reduced. We also slightly changed the type of food on offer due to the shopping habits of our members. We noticed that they were more likely to take the fresh items, like fruit, veg, meat, lunchbox items to feed their children so they can take them to school, and also the frozen food. So this was instead of tins and packet foods. At the beginning of the programme, we ran the social supermarket on a drop-in basis because that was the ethos very much of the warehouse. However, due to the increase in numbers and to provide members with more autonomy, we set up a booking system to allow them then to book their 30-minute slot each week for their shopping. And this has worked really brilliantly and given them more independence. We also changed the type of information we were collecting via our referral form. We wanted to make sure that we were properly conveying the reasons that people aren't working, for example, childcare, and also more information on their debt, such as who is it with and are they currently paying it back. So going forward, we obviously are quite new, so we plan to increase our numbers. We want to reach out to more local businesses and farmers. We obviously don't have a budget that goes on forever and ever. So if we can get surplus from local businesses, local farmers, then even better. we want to expand our wraparound and also continue to network with everyone in the community. In addition, and what I think is really important, is that we want to take the stigma out of using a social supermarket. We want to change the perspective into it being a positive step towards learning how to budget, how to cook, look after your mental health, get yourself into a better position, look for employment or training, and really make that investment in yourself. So I hope this presentation has given you all a wee bit more information of our lived experience over the past year. I would just love really to leave you with one thought. We think that through social supermarkets, we have the real ability to change the narrative of poverty and talk more about potential. Using a social supermarket doesn't just need to represent the basic need for food. Instead, the wraparound, when used effectively, has the ability to provide social support. It can make people be the architects of their own financial identity. It can promote independence, and it can set them up with the tools they need to then grow from that place of empowerment. Although our numbers on the programme at one time may not be massive, it's our hope that the intensive wraparound can then ripple through the family unit and have a real long-term impact. So thank you. That's me. Thank you.
So for those of you in the room, I'll just remind you to raise your hand and wait for the microphone to arrive. Those of you who are coming into us online, you have a Q&A box and you can ask any of your questions there. I understand there are lots of questions already, so that's brilliant. So any questions for our speakers? And maybe you just mentioned the speaker you're addressing the question to as well. We have one here. Hi.
Hi, just a quick question to Megan. If a family goes through your programme, is there any bar on them actually having to go through it again if their circumstances change later on?
Yes, so because we are a relatively new programme at the minute, we are just trying to work with one family the whole way through that 6 months and hopefully set them up. I know that people's circumstances do change and they maybe fall in and out of work, and their benefits, may change, but we haven't had anyone repeat the programme as yet, just because we are keeping our numbers small and we're trying to have that turnaround then of new families getting the chance to come on the programme. But because of where we are in the warehouse, we are then able to say, come and continue to use the other services there, the community fridge and the drop-ins and frozen meals and things, so we never turn people away for food.
I have a question here from Anne-Marie.
Thanks, Aileen. This is a question for Claire. That was a really interesting presentation. Thank you very much, Claire. I was just interested to know what does the time commitment look like for CFR, and how do you keep them engaged in the project? Because you're 2.5 years down the line.
It's a really good question, and in fact, currently it's variable, the time commitment of the CFRs. But when we look over the last 2.5 years, or the last year really of activity, their input and engagement will vary depending on the tasks we're doing at any one time. When we're looking at their remuneration, we're paying them by the hour for their input, and there's a big discussion to be had around how that works from them as an individual, and if that's going to impact their benefits, for example, then we have to think very carefully about how we do that. I would say on average, it's difficult to say, it can range from half a day a week to 2 days a week, really, depending on what we've done. And so, for example, last week, there was a big annual assembly event in Reading for the whole of the consortium project, and all 5 of our community food researchers went to that meeting, and we ran a kind of a shared community food researcher event with our Brighton and Hove CFRs and our Reading CFRs. And they were, so they got paid for some of their time to go away. I mean, obviously not the whole, every single hour that they were away was impossible. So that was a week where there was a lot of activity, whereas this week there might be slightly less. So it's a bit vague, my response. I don't know if that gives you a bit of a flavour.
It's just interesting to understand it.
Yeah. Okay.
We have another question at the back there.
Yeah, my question is to Dr. Clare. I wanted to know what is the focus on sustainability as well with innovation, as you were just mentioning the innovation part of the research work which we were doing. Going forward, do you see sustainability as a major issue you will face? Sustainability.
Sustainability, yeah. I mean, so as you recall, you know, our project is all about co-production of healthy and sustainable food systems for disadvantaged communities. And it's interesting that you raise sustainability, because that's one of the most important parts. And a lot of people have questioned whether fish is an appropriate food commodity for us to be focusing on. But and in fact, you're right, you know, but when you look at the statistics for consumption of fish in disadvantaged communities, in fact, meeting those fish recommendations in lower socioeconomic groups is questionable anyway if you are looking at national data sets. But yes, absolutely, we're looking at sustainability. And what I didn't get the chance to say was we've had lots of discussions to try and identify which fish species are the most sustainable. So, and an example of how complex this is recent, you know, we've gone round and round and round in the circles with this. So our food supply chain experts at Cranfield University were asking us to identify 2 or 3 species that we wanted to focus on, or types of fish. So we asked all our stakeholders in the communities and everybody, and we came up with whiting, oh God, I can't even remember. Whiting, pollack, and I think lemon sole or mackerel. And when we brought that to one of our workshops, one of our industry partners said, but whiting is on the MSC red alert as being a 5 and do not eat. So suddenly we're thinking, okay, well, yeah, that's a good point. So how do you define sustainability? And it's not just a question of the Marine Stewardship Council as being, it's for us in Plymouth, we've identified that there are certain fish that are perhaps bycatch in Plymouth, and these are like not big massive kind of trawlers and that sort of thing, but local fishermen that are coming out of the water that have bycatch that is perhaps not saleable at the market. So what we're trying to do is tap into that supply. I mean, it might be something like dogfish, which, you know, nobody eats because it's a complete pain in the neck to kind of prepare and fillet. But if that could get somehow into the supply chain and create fish fingers for people, then that's the type of thing. So it's highly nuanced, but it is very much on the focus of what we're doing. And our community's knowledge of sustainability was really marked as well. And you know, so health was important, but equally sustainability. And there's a lot of learning around that. But fish, we probably chose the most complex food commodity in that respect, because fish is so nuanced when it comes to sustainability. So hopefully that's gone some. I haven't really answered your question. I've probably opened more questions, but it is very much on our radar. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to move to an online question. I see. I'll come back to you. And this is probably for all of our speakers. One of our online participants has asked, instead of food poverty, what terminology would be more appropriate? And we might start with you, Stephen, on the end from your experience.
Well, we generally have an issue around when we discuss poverty, when we focus it in on individuals and we have individual discussions. So cost of living has actually been a blessing in a way in terms of us accessing and being able to talk to parents around issues involving income and deprivation, because it's sort of seen as all families are experiencing, and that's the narrative that's going. Now, they're not all experiencing it equally. So certainly around food poverty, we chose sort of food insecurity, but it's something that we do want to build on as we're chatting to parents, what they sort of describe it themselves as. You know, when we talk about hunger, you know, again, even in the research questions, parents would have been initially quite hesitant. It was only as the discussion would go on, they might mention food, hunger, that sort of thing. So it's something that I'm not sure I'd have the exact language around at the moment, but it's definitely something to think about, both in terms of food, but in terms of the general area around poverty when we do research, when we put it out there, so it's non-stigmatizing, particularly around parents. As soon as the word poverty is used for us, there's an immediate sense of shame. It reminds them or makes them feel like, oh, actually, I'm not giving them what my children want, what they deserve. And it sort of makes them reticent to look for help around that issue. And, you know, so it's not the word in and of itself, it's the connotations that have developed in society over time. So it probably doesn't quite answer the question, but it is just about that we do need to think about that language when we do talk about the issue.
Anybody else got experience to share?
Whenever we talk about poverty, we tend to try and universalize it. So you could talk about food poverty, fuel poverty, period poverty, which compartmentalizes what is a broader issue around the lack of income. So from a campaigning point of view, we talk about poverty rather than segmenting it. But for research work, for example, we call it hunger in Northern Ireland because hunger is more of a universal term, and I think brings more people into the conversation rather than thinking about poverty as something that affects a certain amount of people, which it does, but we'd like to talk about hunger and also about poverty as a general issue that's related to lack of income.
When it comes to language, it is really, really important, and I'm trying to shift my thinking and that narrative more towards a food justice, you know, that kind of language that, you know, poverty very much hits the problem, and hunger, that they are terms that need to be used in the right context. But I think there's that kind of equality aspect that I think, you know, brings a more kind of positive solutions focused type slant to it. So that's, from my perspective, what I'm trying to, in my mind, think.
And I have another question online. This is for Stephen. Have you any experience of parents speaking about costs of feeding infants, specifically infant formula, breastfeeding associated costs? Maybe others can answer that question as well.
So it did come up, I'd say, at about a quarter of the interviews that I carried out, where parents were saying, just the sheer costs of formula. So it was a big chunk of money. You're talking nearly €20. It might last, obviously, depending on the child, a couple of days. So big concerns about that when, parents would, as I was mentioned earlier, that their money wasn't going as far, so they're doing 2 shops maybe a week. They go to the shops for €40. One mother would have told me straight away that's down to €20. So it has a huge impact. And a couple of parents laughed at the price. They just said it's just, sort of started chuckling, going, yeah, don't get me started on the price of formula. And then when you unpick that a little bit, you can see what's having a knock-on impact. And the sooner the child gets onto milk, the better, that sort of thing. So there wasn't sort of a huge discussion about, children, the worry of children going without the formula. There was never any red flags around that, but it was certainly a big issue about just being able to have, even there was never more than 1 box of formula in the house, for example. So they couldn't, and that's a concern. Formula doesn't last that long, So, after a couple of days, they're right, we've got to go out and get some. If you're in the middle of the night feeding the child and you're going, oh, hang on a second, will I have enough in the morning? It's just even the practicalities, but it definitely came up quite a bit. I mean, it's just a huge chunk of money every week for parents when their money isn't going particularly far.
I come to you at the back. Thank you for your patience.
Hi, this is a question for Johnny. I was just wondering, what are the biggest challenges you face when trying to move away from your current model of food banking?
The biggest challenge is that folks' income isn't meeting their needs to pay for the essentials. So for us, the biggest driver that will help us to exit the scene is more money in people's pockets. So we have much stronger referral pathways than we did in the much stronger referral pathways than our food banks had in the past. What's the onward referral journey that makes a person less likely to come back? Very often it's a social supermarket referral, or it's an income maximisation conversation with an advice provider. But we're finding more and more that people are having their income max, they're having a benefit entitlement check, but they're still having to go back to food bank because they still not have enough money to afford the benefits for themselves. So it is a policy change in terms of those kind of basic levels of universal credit that need to rise. That would be the biggest overall impact. I mean, there'll be nuances locally and in different regions where there are other interventions, but for us, it's around financial inclusion.
Thank you. A question for Megan on the screen. You mentioned the well-fed van, which may deliver food to those in a rural situation. How do they select their shopping? Do they do that online? And how are the wraparound services then provided on an online or phone basis? That's an interesting angle, yeah.
Yeah, so with the van and with the social supermarket overall, we try to give as much choice as we possibly can. So for the van to be fully stocked, we select just a few options. So options of the frozen food, options of the fridge food, and make sure there's that full round selection really and choice. Because we are quite small, we do have the time to link in with people. You know, you've just had a baby, what formula is your baby on, what nappies are you using at the minute, what baby wipes are you using, we'll make sure they're on the van for you. So it is just about offering that choice and getting to know the members on the social supermarket, like what do they like, what do they take, what are their shopping habits, and then over the 6 months then, you know, we just get to know that person. And as for the wraparound, we're quite lucky that our peninsula has quite a lot of services already. So we're not about reinventing the wheel. We are about, you know, saying this, you know, these are the wraparound services in your community and linking people to them. And then other things such as, you know, the paper, maybe budget planners and things like that, then will be taken down to them and given to them with their shopping. And I'll meet each person individually as well. So, yeah.
Thanks, Megan. Laura, is there?
Just first to say thank you to everyone. A really thought-provoking morning. I loved all of the presentation. Well, loved is the wrong word because quite difficult listening at times as well. My question is around access. Claire, I know in your presentation you said that came through as one of the biggest issues. And Megan, it was interesting to hear the feedback from the users in the Well-Fed project, wanting, you know, preference for fresh vegetables, less of the packets and tins, and we know that can be one of the issues with food banks. But I'm just wondering, our own research at Consumer Council shows that people using smaller shops, they're finding these barriers accessing fresh produce. Is there more, do the panel feel, is there more that the local network of convenience stores could do to address that need? Why is it there isn't that supply and demand relationship going on? If this is what people want, why could that not be provided? Thoughts?
That's a very interesting question. I need a bit of time to process that.
Being funding through commercial entities. And there's so much research that we know that the retail sector does into consumer preferences and needs, but it doesn't seem to filter through then to making that produce accessible to certainly more disadvantaged communities.
I think there's, I mean, so I'm thinking of the specific place-based community we're working with in Plymouth, which is not the most disadvantaged community in Plymouth, but it's one of the kind of top 5, as it were, top 5. That's you know what I mean. And it's removed from the city centre. Plymouth is cut in half by the A38, so it's quite spread out. And when you look at the local food environment, access to fruit and veg there's no fruit and veg van, there's no greengrocer anymore. You've got the co-op, and then you've got quite a dispersed kind of large supermarket kind of access. And things like, you've got Healthy Start vouchers, we're just about to run a fruit and veg voucher scheme as part of Food Sequel. That's a kind of separate part of the project. But there's something around, I don't even know what I'm trying to say. What they identified was it wasn't so much that they're not there or not available, it was the kind of the type that was available. So certainly in our sample was quite biased towards kind of middle age, 40 plus, that kind of age group. So we didn't really have the youth, the young people's voices, but they were looking for veg that was kind of single person consumption, so it's, as well as it not being available, it's how it's available and whether people can actually access that, and they won't buy it if they feel they're going to waste it. But yeah, I'm just waffling and not actually answering your question because I'm not quite sure how to answer your question, sorry.
I noticed for us, it's about trying to get into the supply chain as well. So we work with a local farmer, and he has carrots, parsnips, cabbages, everything. And he has bags upon bags of wonky veg that he just cannot get rid of. The supermarkets won't buy it because people want their carrots the same size as their parsnips, so they can cut them and they'll cook together at the same time. So he then donates the carrots and the parsnips that he can't give to like Tesco, Asda, wherever else. So he can't be the only farmer in that position. He can't be the only business in that position. We work with Mash Direct and other local businesses that the supply timeline is too long for them to get their short brace product into the shop. So they're giving that to us, and then we're giving that to the community. But that's only 3 places in our local area. There's bound to be more, and it's how we get in, to get that, and so that doesn't end up in the bin. We know, fine rightly, there's businesses out there that are burning food, that are putting it in the dump. That can go to people. It's perfectly good food. Yes, it's maybe one day past it's used by, or past its best before, depending on what it is. But a lot of it can still be used. So it's where we get access for ourselves to give that to the community as well.
Johnny, you'll see there's a question online there. Why is it difficult to access social security information for citizens and non-citizens?
First of all, I think there's a broader political, ideological reason for that, in that the government doesn't want you to access these things. So for anyone that's tried to access child tax or working tax credits in NI, it's incredibly complicated. It would put you off wanting to try to do it. So there are a lot of barriers that are put in place that I think are ideological. From the point of view of folks that we're seeing that are accessing food banks for the first time, and as food bank use goes upstream, you've got folks who just aren't used to reaching out for this kind of support before, so they don't actually know where to go, they don't know where the points of contact and where the points of support are. You'll have seen from the map earlier where our food banks are based. As you go west of the Ban, provision thins out. So that reflects the rurality of west of the Ban, but also that services are a lot more spread out. Also, broadband access is much more patchy in very rural parts of Northern Ireland. So as a lot of social security entitlement and access is online, there are huge barriers there to be able to access that. The question also referred to non-citizens. I assume that's folks with no recourse to public funds. So if you're in the asylum system, you can't really access much of that support unless you get you can through the process and you get refugee or settled status on the other side. So there's a range of barriers. There, language is one as well for people that are citizens but just can't get access to support that's in their own language as well. So those are a few of the challenges that we see.
Thanks, Johnny. I have one question here for the lady in red, and then another for yourself.
For both Stephen and Johnny, just to get the North and South perspective. You both speak about like the voicelessness, and inadequacy that comes with lack of income and hunger. So I was wondering, do you also have like a mental health aid or a mental health referral project that you refer these people to give them that sort of help, as well as food poverty aid as well? Thank you.
So in terms of, if parents, for example, that we're working with are struggling around low incomes and additional anxiety because of cost of living increases and food insecurity, depending on the level of mental health issue, we may make referrals across. Now, how well those referrals will be taken up depends obviously on threshold levels for adult mental health teams and things like that. But our own services will work with parents around it. So, and that's realistically why parents will have been, and families will have been referred into our services in the first place. So it's about coping mechanisms for parents. It's about trying to reduce triggers and stressors as much as possible around anxieties, and particularly about when they're engaging with their children and their parenting. Unfortunately, what we're trying to do is we're trying to reduce those as much as possible for parents who have pre-existing maybe mental health or mental well-being issues, and putting children in the best environment as possible. Unfortunately, this actually makes things worse. So, tackling this is an even bigger, of greater importance nearly to some of those families, because that additional anxiety, it's not just about accessing food and income to them, it's also about their overall well-being, because it's hugely diminished. And we do work quite a lot around that, but a lot of that comes back to, the real solution to this. We can build coping mechanisms, we can build things to deal with in certain circumstances, but as Johnny sort of alluded to numerous times, realistically what we need is additional income for those families and parents, and sustainable income.
We do a lot of work with our food banks to ensure that it's a welcoming space for people where they feel safe and able to be supported. But the reality is you're still encountering people at probably one of the lowest points they've ever been in their lives. And it's incredibly traumatic to cross the door of a food bank. So we are aware of the need to make sure that there's ongoing support available. So we work very closely in England with Mind, and we're developing a partnership with Inspire in the north here to provide an ongoing referral pathway for people to get advocacy and mental health support once they present at a food bank in some sort of crisis, to make sure that people get that support. It's something that we're certainly seeing more of.
We had one more question here, and I'm actually going to have to cut questions after that. There's too much engagement, which is a very good complaint.
Mine is a comment and a question. I just saw the new film by Ken Loach called The Old Oak, where a group of Syrian refugees move into a north of England village. And just what struck me about it is food, it doesn't overcome racism, but it certainly brought people together. And I'm just curious really about the development of, I know Crosscare had one here in Dublin, is community food kind of, I suppose, canteens or kitchens that offer low-cost meals that bring people together, but also I think the three-course meal was a £5. I haven't been there for about 6 or 7 years, and I don't know whether it still exists, but I'm curious about in the north or anywhere else really, does that kind of community eating facilities happen? Or is it something we should be looking at?
It happens a wee bit where we are in the warehouse. So as I was saying, we do drop-ins. We would have lunches on a Tuesday, Wednesday and Thursday, and then breakfast on a Friday. So it is, as it says on the tin, a drop-in situation. Families from the local area, socially isolated people, just anyone can come down, sit and have a meal, and it's no questions asked. It's, you can sit there the whole day and drink tea and coffee and read a book, or you can come over and have a chat with us, and we have found that a really good referral pathway for the social supermarket as well, that once you sit down and you talk to people, they do start to tell you their story. There always will be that kind of limit where people don't want to go over the threshold and they think then, oh, I'm coming across as poor, I'm coming across that I can't look after my children properly, maybe social services will get involved and they'll take my children away. That is just a thought that everyone has all the time in the back of their mind. So it's really about, sitting the family down and saying, these are the supports, we're here, we can help you. And we would get a lot of families of Ukrainian background and Syrian background in Newton Ards that would be then coming and using the services. So, yeah.
Thank you. And we are unfortunately going to have to bring our Q&A session to a close. I know we haven't got to a number of questions online, so with your permission, if we could get back to some of those participants later on, that would be fantastic in a written format. Could you put your hands together, please, and thank our panel for a really deep and wide-ranging discussion. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thank you. So the final talk in our session this morning is from our colleague Robert Thornton from the Vincentian MESL partnership at the Vincent de Paul. Robert is a research manager there and has been working on the minimum standard of living research since 2010. He's been working with both safefood and FSA-NI on our food basket research for many of those years, and you're very welcome this morning to close our session, Robert. Thank you.
Good start. Thanks, Aileen, and thanks to safefood and the Food Standards Agency for the invitation to make a contribution today. So in preparation for the event today, I've been reading the reports and about the activities that each of the contributors have spoke about this morning. And there are recurring themes which stood out for me, probably because of how they resonate with the MESL, or Minimum Essential Standard of Living research. So in the MESL research, we work with members of the public, drawing on the lived experience of real people, contributing their expertise as they discuss what are the essential goods and services that people need to be able to live with dignity. And from that, we can then shine a light on the income people need in order to afford the essentials of life, and also highlight where there's a gap between incomes and minimum living costs, which result in people having to choose what to do without in order to make ends meet. In this context, the research from Bernardo's was striking, but unfortunately not shocking. It described the increasing rate of people cutting back and going without essentials, and the trade-offs people are making. Stephen told us how a fifth of people are cutting back on food due to the cost of living pressures, while others trade off other essentials such as heat in order to afford food, that all too familiar heat or eat dilemma. There are also accounts of juggling and cutting back in other areas, not replacing worn out clothing, delaying health treatments, not being able to take part in activities, children missing out in sports, not able to attend birthday parties and so forth. The Hunger in Northern Ireland report then from the Trussell Trust was also stark, finding that a sixth of adults in their households in Northern Ireland have experienced food insecurity, hunger. And as Johnny explained, this is because people simply don't have enough money. Again, the findings are unfortunately unsurprising. People with a disability, working age single adults, people out of work, and families with children overrepresented in those who experience food insecurity and need to rely on a food bank. Well Fed then showed us an example of how a community supermarket can support people with access to affordable food and individual supports, while also providing the dignity of choice in how people meet their food needs. And the Food Sequel project showed us an approach based on working with people, drawing on lived experience to inform responses to food insecurity, but also recognizing that affordability is a fundamental issue, that people need to have enough money to choose and buy the food they need. So across these presentations, I was struck by the indignity of people having to do without essentials, having to turn to charitable assistance in order to get support in meeting some of their essential needs, that people are being pushed into this situation because of inadequate income. And as the Bernardo's report states, it's simply a matter of not having sufficient income to meet costs. The Trussell Trust report similarly found in Northern Ireland that the fundamental reason people are referred to food banks is that their income is too low for them to be able to afford the essentials we all need in life. In both cases, an adequate and sufficient social protection system is needed to enable people to afford the essentials of life and live with dignity. Looking at the Irish government's anti-poverty strategy, the Roadmap for Social Inclusion, they describe social inclusion as people having access to sufficient income, resources and services to actively participate at a level considered normal for society. And Goal 7 of the roadmap refers to core essentials, ensuring that all people can live with confidence that they have access to good quality healthcare, housing, energy and food. And in a food poverty report published by the Department of Social Protection last year, Minister Joe O'Brien's foreword acknowledged the complexity of food poverty, that there are issues regarding access and skills, but also states that first and foremost, we know that people need sufficient income to buy food. And a recent interim report to the Food Poverty Working Group, established under the roadmap, has said that it's impossible to separate food poverty from general poverty. So as such, food poverty is a facet of broader poverty and income adequacy. And ultimately, we know that in Ireland, north and south, the social protection systems don't provide people with an adequate income to live with dignity and afford essentials. This demonstrates that at least part of the way forward must be the progressive realisation of a social protection system that's benchmarked to an adequate level, which allows people to live with dignity. And the MESL research aims to provide a benchmark of what people need to live with dignity, and to assess the gap between needs and incomes. We update our MESL research annually to reflect current prices and publish an analysis of the changing cost of minimum needs. And the presentations here today resonate with the findings of our research. In this year's update, there was a considerable 10.6% increase in the cost of a minimum basket across the range of household types we examine. And this was above the average inflation rate as measured by the CPI, or Consumer Price Index, because food and energy make up a much larger share of the minimum basket than the average basket measured in headline inflation. Together, food and energy account for 1/3 of the MESL basket, compared to 1/6 of the CPI basket. And as a result, the minimum basket is more sensitive to changes in food and energy prices. So in this year's analysis, we repriced the MESL food component and found that the cost of staples had increased significantly. For example, we found milk had increased by 54%, eggs were up 32%, butter was up 72%, and bread had increased by 67%. So overall, our minimum food basket showed an increase in costs of 21% in the 12 months to March of this year. This means that the cost of the minimum healthy food basket in the MESL will potentially consume a large share of a household's social welfare income. For example, in 2023, purchasing the MESL food basket would take over 1/3 of the social welfare income for a one-parent household with a primary and second level age child, over 1/4 of a working age single adult's job seekers payment, and over 1/5 of the state pension for an older single adult living alone. So this indicates that households in these situations face an inability to afford a nutritionally adequate diet. High costs and inadequate income will mean trade-offs will have to be made. Our findings this year show that the income supports provided by the social protection system haven't kept pace with the change in minimum living costs, that social welfare supports now meet a lower proportion of minimum needs, and the consequence of this is that many household cases are being pulled into income inadequacy. So looking ahead, inflation forecasts from the ESRI and Department of Finance show that while inflation is expected to ease this year and next, prices overall are still expected to continue rising, just at a slower rate, and are not expected to return to earlier levels. So to protect the real value of core weekly social welfare rates, they must be adjusted in line with inflation and the living cost increases which are impacting households on low incomes. And fundamentally, the way forward must be the progressive realisation of a broad strategy to benchmark social protection systems to an adequate level which allows people to live with dignity. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Robert, for your really comprehensive summing up. It's, I suppose, a stark reminder of why we're here today, and things don't look like they're going to get too much better in the near future, unfortunately. I'm going to take this moment to say goodbye to our online participants. I'd like to thank you for your engagement and your attention over the course of the morning. What will happen for you who are joining us online is that you'll be presented with a QR code which will link you to our survey, and we'd really appreciate if you would fill that out. It helps us keep improving on our events.